you would like to kick off, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma Kate. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're calling in from, the Yagara and Turrbal nations, and elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the sovereignty, ongoing sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples all across Australia. The Next Economy, for anyone who doesn't know much about us, we're an organisation, we're a not-for-profit organisation that works with communities that are confronting economic change. So it could be dealing with economic challenges, or it could be more forward-thinking and proactive around a vision for what a regional economy wants to see happen. So tonight, what we want to share with you is some findings of what we've been hearing from regional Queensland over the last 15 months. We've consulted to nearly 500 people, and the question framing that has been, how have changes to the energy system been impacting on regional areas, and what are the economic opportunities in actually managing the transition and managing that change? So we've travelled from Cairns and Townsville in the north through to Gladstone and Rockhampton, central Queensland, and Toowoomba and Kingaroy in the southwest of the state. In most of those places, we've run at least 2 events. So generally, we've had a roundtable discussion with industry and government that's been invite only and closed door. And then we've also had open community forums at which we've had mostly participants from different community groups, some environment groups, unions, small business, and a lot of farmers as well at the community forums. We've also done a number of individual interviews with key people involved in economic development. So it could be people at council or regional development authority and organisations like that to get a sense of what's going on locally. I should acknowledge at this point that we drew on the expertise of a range of different organisations. So we had Wendy Farmer, who's on this call, very graciously came up to Queensland to share the experiences of the Latrobe Valley. We also had Dan Musil from the Latrobe Valley talk about experiences in a different set of workshops. Julie Lyford from the Hunter Valley talking about the Hunter renewal process and what's happening down there. Christy Walters from the Community Power Agency talking about changes to the renewable energy sector. Verity Morgan-Smith talking about opportunities for farmers around renewable energy. And Andre Grant from the Centre for Appropriate Technology in Cairns talking about some of the projects that are happening up on the Cape and Indigenous communities around renewable energy as well. So these were a mix of different forums. Some were funded by government and some were funded by philanthropy and by philanthropists who are interested in regional development, and trying to shift the conversation from this kind of very polarised political discussion around the energy system to one where we can start thinking about, well, how do we manage the changes that are here so that regional communities can benefit? I should note at this point, this is not, the report that we wrote actually isn't, the aim of it wasn't a detailed list of what came out of each region, as in terms of a consultation report. What the aim of that was, I actually wrote the report in the first week of COVID lockdown back in March, because we'd collected all these ideas from across the state and just collated that into one list, in a generic list, saying to government, well, basically what happened is I emailed the main ministers and said, hey, we've been collecting all these ideas and actually you paid for us to collect some of these ideas. You're considering COVID responses and economic recovery, would you be interested? And I got, within 5 minutes, a text message from the Premier's office saying, what have you got? So that prompted me to write the report. So it's not really a consultation report on each individual area, and we purposely haven't gone into detail about each region. It was more of a master list saying, well, if you're going to spend billions of dollars on recovery, here are some ideas that have actually come out of direct consultation with communities. So our goal was, in doing all of these activities, was to get people on the same page as to what's actually happening with the energy system, where the transition is at, share some stories around how other communities are dealing with it, but really try and create a safer space to have a conversation, to move beyond some of the fear and division that has plagued this conversation. So today I don't want to go in blow by blow, point by point details of what came out of the report because you can read it. I want to reflect on some of the main themes that kept coming up again and again throughout the workshops, and across, and sort of take sector by sector what's coming out. So, of course, a lot of the discussion was about energy, and something shifted over that 15-month period where there's become a greater acceptance around the fact that renewable energy is here. In all of the regions, there are very large-scale renewable energy projects that have been rolled out or planned. And so there's a lot more acceptance now that the transition is here. There was also a lot of support, especially from industry, in saying that they want to be taking advantage of that renewable energy, but there are some things that need to change. In terms of investment in the infrastructure that's needed to be able for the grid to be able to take on more renewable energy and move that energy around so that industry can use it. So there was a lot of talk about renewable energy zones, and interestingly, last Thursday, the Queensland government made an announcement that if elected, they will be investing in renewable energy corridors and that transmission infrastructure upgrade, which is really good news. And what industry was saying that they needed to be able to move forward. A lot of people express frustration around power prices, that there's renewable energy, but people aren't seeing benefit personally around lower power prices. But there was a lot of excitement too around the potential. So if industry can capture the benefits of renewable energy, the potential around hydrogen and ammonia production, as well as other renewable energy products, and particularly up north, a lot of discussion around processing minerals and keeping the existing minerals processing industries going, and the potential for it to expand into green metals. And there's a lot of talk about internationally, that it's possible now to make green steel or green aluminium, and how can we compete by processing those metals here. There's also a lot of discussion around making sure that we look after people through change. So not just fossil fuel workers, and there was a lot of concern about the future for fossil fuel workers, but how we can make renewable energy accessible to renters, low-income households, remote communities and Aboriginal communities, and not just in access to solar panels, but also batteries and energy efficiency measures as well. The really surprising thing that came out of a number of the forums was an open acknowledgement by people working at power plants in the forums that the closure of coal-fired electricity plants is inevitable and might actually happen sooner than anyone's talking about. Now, that had come up before in discussions behind closed doors, but this is the first time that I've seen people talking about that publicly. In terms of agriculture, the first half of the forum, like last year, the focus was very much on water, and there was sort of interest in things like carbon farming and climate resilience, but it was still a lot of frustration around some of the carbon financing hadn't been sorted out and that the money wasn't flowing. But there was a lot of support around supporting Indigenous land managers, so First Nations groups, and recognising the role that they play in sequestering carbon and protecting land and amplifying that and making sure economic benefits are flowing. In terms of the mining sector, it was probably the most contentious area, which is not surprising in the discussion. And I guess the main theme that came out is that people are not anti-coal. They're not necessarily pro-coal either. They're pro-jobs. And so people just want to see where are the jobs and how do we start investing in that. There was increasing uncertainty around the future of fossil fuels, both coal and gas, and a general kind of feeling that we need to diversify the mining sector. So focusing on the development of the northwest region of the state and focusing on other minerals such as lithium, copper, zinc, nickel, and rare earth minerals. There was some discussion in a few places around some disappointment that gas hadn't delivered on its promises in terms of long-term jobs, infrastructure, or economic benefits flowing to the region. And a feeling, and that conversation coming up around hydrogen, that we don't repeat the mistakes of that rollout of LNG over a really short period of time. There's a lot of support for manufacturing, even before COVID, which I think is really interesting to note. There was a sense that Australia is not resilient enough and that we should be producing a lot more locally. And people getting excited about the idea that if we've got this cheap, locally available renewable energy, can we start adding value to what we actually produce here? And there's a lot of really interesting work going on in regional universities around the digital technology that's actually going to enable that to happen. Waste was a really interesting issue because it wasn't really directly related to what we were talking about, but a lot of councils are taking a lot of initiative in the circular economy space, and that real shift from seeing it as waste management to resource investment in resource recovery and what can be done there. Transport, there wasn't a lot of, it's probably the area that was least developed in people's minds around the possibilities, and it was talked about in very much a future sense. So if we had more EVs, or, you know, talk about potential for manufacturing opportunities or biofuels. So it's kind of talked about in the need for planning for transport, but not a lot of really well-formed thoughts of what that needs to happen. And another interesting point that came up before, but also after the bushfires and COVID, was a lot of people talking about the need for regions to be a lot more self-sufficient and to be determining their own future. So there's a lot of talk about health, and this was before COVID, and that there need to be a lot more investment in health, professional services, financial services, a lot of services that aren't being met in regional communities at the moment, and investment in that. So again, I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about what came out of each region, but there were some general kind of themes. So in Toowoomba and South Burnett, there was more focus on talking about agriculture, but particularly water issues at that time, was at the height of the drought. And a lot of talk about some interesting waste initiatives. In Rockhampton, Rockhampton was interesting because it was the place with the strongest push for a discussion, the need for transition planning around coal-fired plants. So in the broader region, there's 3 coal-fired electricity plants, and it was actually workers from the plant saying we need to actually come up with a plan so we can look after everyone, because we might have time, but we need to start planning that now. There's also a lot of focus on agriculture, a bit of skepticism around carbon farming, but also interestingly that high protein crops are a big industry that's growing in the region. And it was noted that the Meat and Livestock Association have a 2030 carbon neutral target. And now last week, the National Farmers Federation came out with a carbon neutral target by 2050 as well. So a lot of discussion happening within agriculture around what that means. Gladstone and Townsville having more an industrial base, there was a lot more excitement around the potential for renewable energy if we can get the transmission infrastructure right. So things like Copperstring 2.0 to connect Townsville with Mount Isa, for example. So let's talk about the battery factory in Townsville, hydrogen and ammonia production in both areas, advanced manufacturing potential. And it's really about how do we stay who we are and invest in the future, and also become more competitive in what we can produce. And Cairns is the most recent one we've done a few weeks ago. Not surprisingly, a lot of talk around tourism and building on the green ecotourism brand of Cairns, and actually doubling down on that. So there's a lot of renewable energy being produced in the region that's being exported. So there's now discussion around how do we capture the benefits of that locally to support local business, bring down prices. There's a lot of investment in digital technology and thinking about the Internet of Things, for example. Some really interesting things happening in Cairns. So in terms of a summary around the general kind of discussions that were had, I think the first thing that really surprised me, and it was a big shift from say 18 months ago, is there was just a lot more acceptance that change is here. People know that renewable energy is here, not just on their rooftop, but on a large scale. But they want to know how to capitalise on it better and want to see those benefits locally. People want to diversify their economies. So there's a feeling that the economy is not resilient enough and that we need to diversify and build in a range of sectors. And a sense that people had moved on from debating climate change, which was interesting. And the classic example of this was in one workshop where I'd done my introduction presentation on what the workshop was on, and a young person from a university said, well, you haven't mentioned climate change. We need to be talking about this as climate change. And I said, well, actually the workshop is on the economic benefits of the energy transition. And he was persistent about wanting to talk about climate change. And then somebody else said, no, climate change, I don't think, my geologist friend has got evidence that that's not. And they started to get into an argument about climate change. And I made the offer that, we could talk about it, or I could send through information later on or put them in touch with other organisations that can explain this to them. But the argument was escalating and I ended up taking a deep breath and taking a step back. And what was really interesting was it was a senior manager of a coal-fired electricity plant who actually stepped in and said, you know what, it doesn't matter what anyone believes. The world is changing, global markets are changing. We need to get on board with this and plan for it because we don't get to control that, but we're vulnerable if we don't get ahead. Like this, we've got to get on with business. Let's get on with business. And that was the end of the conversation. And I thought that really summed up particularly the forums we've done this year, that people just want to get on with it. They want to make sure that no one's left behind. That was a really strong theme, particularly concern about the future of fossil fuel workers, but also not being very certain, and also not being certain about the future of those industries. So people disagree on the timeframes, but there was strong agreement that we need to start planning for what's going to happen. And that was exacerbated too by the bushfires, and now COVID, I think, has really added to that sense of uncertainty and vulnerability, and people saying we've got to start diversifying a lot more. But there's also positive stuff. It wasn't all fear. It's actually like people being really excited about some of the technology that's coming through and opportunities around things like green metals, hydrogen, etc. But the really interesting, I think, personally, the most interesting discussion that came out a lot, particularly this year, was the questions about the role of government in all of this. There was quite a bit of scepticism and anger directed towards government. And it ended up leading to a really interesting discussion in most of the forums, actually asking people, well, what is the role of government versus the role of industry? And having a really productive conversation around what people need from government moving forward. So people were saying things like investment in big infrastructure, like the really big infrastructure that industry can't build on its own. So something like renewable energy corridors, for example, would be an example of that. Transport infrastructure, de-risking investment opportunities for the private sector by having stable climate and energy policy in place. Good regulation. This is what industry people saying they wanted regulation, which could have knocked me down when they said that. But they were saying that, you know, industry can do so much, but if we want to see good practice and a level playing field, it is government's role to set the standards around workplace health and safety, pay conditions, that kind of thing. And preparing the workforce for the future, investing in the education, TAFE, universities to make that happen. And also more support, business support. So developing supply chains, feasibility studies, funding that, and coordinating across industry and bringing different players together. Very strong theme was people want to lead this at a regional level. They know their community better than anyone else, but they do need support around bringing people together around that. And that's where they want government leadership. They do know what they want and they're already starting to take action. And I think the main thing from all of this is all of the ideas that were generated, which are all at different stages, are actually really good stimulus ideas. Like we're in a situation where government is, state and federal government are going to be spending billions moving forward. So this is a chance to actually build for the future the infrastructure and systems that we need. And finally, I think that the biggest shift really I saw in the conversations from last year to this year were the bushfires. As one power station worker commented, different one to the one before, she said, the fires were the burning platform that we needed to all wake up and start tackling this issue. And she wasn't just talking about climate change, she was talking about regions building a lot more strength and thinking long-term about their futures and how they build that resilience. So the theme was, it's not the time to be cutting investment in services, but ramping up that investment and decentralisation of a lot of things that communities need to be strong into the future. And on that note, I'm going to leave it there and we can open it up to questions.
Great. Well, seeing we can all fit on one screen, well, all on my one screen, maybe we just leave the chat box aside, and just if you've got a question, just unmute yourself. And maybe you turn on your camera if that's not going to mess with your connection as well.
I've got a couple, but I will start with one related to one of your last comments. When people were talking about governments, did they make any distinction between local, state, or federal government? How do they talk about governments?
Yeah, so local governments in all areas were doing quite a lot already, but they were sort of, their message was there's only so much they can do. There's a whole lot of portfolios they don't have control over, and so they need state and federal government to, kind of a lot of anger around, just get the policies right so things can move rather than chopping and changing all the time. But it's been interesting. It's been on the back of the forums, we've been getting a lot of requests from local government saying, great, this is good, we've had a public conversation, now let's take it to the next level, and them wanting to lead the planning process, which I think is really great that they're coming at it from that and wanting to pull people together to take action.
But we can.
Could I just quickly say before the next question, if you just want to introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, good idea.
Me?
Yes, Denise, you can retrospectively introduce yourself if you like.
Apologies. I'm Denise Nogueira. I'm a PhD student at KUT, researching on alternative economies and currently social finance. That's it, basically.
Thanks, Denise. And I think Adam.
Yeah, g'day everybody. Adam Sadler from the Cassowary Coast. I'm the Director of Delivery Services. Some of that commentary was fantastic in the sense that local government in these times has really stepped up, and because at the end of the day we've got to look after our communities, and we're the best people that know what our communities need, and I think that sort of gets forgotten. And like you said, there's some frustration out there, particularly from the other two tiers of government, where they think they know best, but you know what, they really don't. I'm sure Councillor Farinelli, who's also online, our portfolio chair of economic development, would share that with me. We've been doing a lot of work over the last few weeks in relation to this. And you also mentioned the double down of tourism in the north, and that's one of the strengths that we're levering in relation to our economic recovery from the situation that we are in. So I don't know, Councillor Farinelli, did you want to add anything to that?
Councillor Kylie Farinelli, so Cassowary Coast Regional Council, so newly elected, but I have done a term previously in 2012 to 2016. So I'm a farmer, have been a farmer for 25 years. And for me, what we're trying to do for the Cassowary Coast, and something that's been really important to me since 2006, but I've sort of seemed to have this vision ahead of what everybody else has got. Finally, they're catching up to me, is to really develop our agriculture and start opening their eyes to opportunities around ag tourism. So there's a lot of work that Adam and I and our tourism officer are starting to do around trying to come up with ways to, I suppose, expose potential within the ag sector in our region. Farming is pretty much, farmers, from what I've experienced, they're very tunnel visioned, and they are used to sitting on their tractors every day, and that's how they do it, and this is it. But the thing that I'm looking at is future-proofing farming, I suppose. Yeah. Say, and the future-proofing farming, I think, is targeting the next generation. Farming in the future will not look like it does now, and will not look like it did 50 years ago. And the only way we're going to keep our younger generation interested and engaged in our farming is by opening their eyes to other opportunities. And that's where I see ag tourism playing a big part. It's just a matter now, I think, the interest is there. The next part is trying to get some funding from the other two tiers of government in basically opening up the potential and exposing that to farmers who've, as I said, historically had this tunnel vision. How do we now, our biggest challenge is, how do we open their eyes to the potential that's out there?
Yeah, that's great. And particularly because farming is facing a huge labour shortage. I mean, it already has one, but it's looking, was it 100? There was, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but a lot of farmers are at an age, like the average age of a farmer is I think sugarcane farmers 72, and other farmers are in their 60s. So we're facing a huge shortage of workforce, and you know, it's interesting, the discussion, the celebration around the Pacific Islanders coming back, which is good, but it's also like, well, Australians aren't going to take these jobs. I'm like, well, why aren't Australians going to take these jobs? That to me is the issue we should be looking at.
And I think from a small, like a regional area like we've got a small population of 28 to 29,000 people. And I've always said the strength of our economy is reliant on the strength of our ag industry, because if you have strong, if the ag industry is strong and they're making money, that feeds off into the rest of the community, and especially from a regional perspective. So, and we were in Cairns the other day at a session with QTIC, and you know, and I know Cairns is doing it really, really tough, but you know, they're really relying on the surrounding. I think that while there's no international tourism, and for drive tourism, I suppose they're quite sort of north and away from things. What they really need to see is support from the surrounding regions, and the support from the surrounding regions will come when we're all experiencing a strong economy. And if we can really build up this ag and sort of expose the potential around tourism. Oh, look, I've travelled extensively, and you look at how the Barossa does things, Tasmania does things. There's all of these other areas that have really embraced ag tourism. We're just sort of missing this next step, I think. And if we can achieve that, if we can find our way into ag tourism, it's just going to open up so much potential for the far north. And the benefit will be felt not just within my region of the Cassowary Coast, but in neighbouring regions as well.
I might, I'm going to put Emma Kate on the spot and if you can get her your email, we can follow up, because Emma Kate's done a lot of work in the food movement and knows of, I think there'd just be an interesting conversation there to have offline. And also, interestingly, I've appeared before the Economic and Governance Committee of the Queensland Government looking into the COVID response, and there were questions about how do we get younger people into ag and what are the programs and things that would enable that. So let's have a conversation about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, is future-proofing farming. That's how I look at it, future-proofing farming, and finding ways to engage that younger generation. If we can do that, I tell you, it's just going to be amazing. And I mean, there's a great potential for farming in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Carly.
Thanks, Amanda. Can I just bring us back to the other bit that you just talked about with ag as well, around getting the younger generation to actually work on one of the things that Councillor Farnelly and I have been talking about is a mentoring program, but also the bit that you just highlighted before around the fact that we do have Vanuatuans and many other different nationalities working within our region. And what happens every Friday is all the money leaves the region and goes overseas via Western Union. Yeah. And I suppose one of the challenges that we've been talking about earlier this week and starting to advocate for is around things with like JobKeeper and JobSeeker, where why don't we actually talk to our ag businesses about how we can actually apply that funding better and actually employ an Australian to do that work. And so whether that actually tops up the dollars that the farmer has to pay the salaries and gets our locals into work.
It's an interesting one, because I'm torn, because I've worked a lot in the Pacific and the Philippines, so I've seen also what that money can do for communities. But it's a tricky one. But it's a conversation we need to have, I think, more openly around the future of the sector.
Don't disagree. I mean, knowing the business that runs Western Union, knowing that $50,000 leaves the region every Friday, if not more, sort of makes us wonder, hang on, something's not quite right here.
Yeah, that we can have that conversation, because there's a whole history around aid policy and actually reducing aid to the region and encouraging that. Anyway, let's get back. I need to get back to this report, because there might be other people who have other questions, but I'm really keen to have the conversation. Other questions?
I have a question, which is just that I observed in your summation of the report a frequent sense of culture change, a culture shift. I'm interested in that because I'm interested in social dynamics of rural communities. And the way in which you were presenting it was that it gave a sense that there was more openness to change, which would be a revolution.
Yeah, sorry, have you finished? Yeah. So am I cutting you off? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I was really shocked because I've been doing this work now for, like, specifically on this issue since 2006. In working with regional communities across Australia around just having a discussion around energy and transition and what needs to happen. And it's interesting because the conversation keeps opening up and shutting down. So the reason I started doing this work was back in 2014 because I did a one-off presentation in Mackay at a request of a local group so somebody was doing a talk on the end of coal, basically, and for the first time, people in Mackay, because the coal price had been down for 2 years, people actually were sort of going, yeah, we know, like, what if coal doesn't come back? And so the local environment group who was hosting the talks went, oh, we've never had that response before from people in Mackay. We don't know what to say to them. Don't you do this economic development work? Can you come and talk to them about it? And I was like,
people come and watch in here.
And so people were very open then because the coal price had been down for 2 years. And then things changed. Coal price came back and then the conversation shut down again. And then it opened up around Hazelwood shutting down and then it closed down again. But for the 2017 to 2019, the conversation became very hostile around energy.
Absolutely.
And the federal election, I think, became framed in that way. And I think the conversation straight after that, some of the early ones, people were very hesitant to talk about this issue. The fires, there's a couple of turning points. One was hydrogen. I think that the fact that there's a potential export commodity that is very valuable, that if it was developed up, people could see a future for regions, whereas before it was like, if this industry goes, there's no future. So I think hydrogen has shifted the conversation, and it's also opened up questions around heavy industry. So that's a lot of people who were like feeling under attack, that that their community couldn't be anymore, or they couldn't do what they did anymore, kind of could see a future for themselves. So that was a big shift. The fires were another shift, and it was a shift around the climate change conversation because, like I said, the example I gave was classic. It was just like people like, we don't want to argue about that anymore. We just want to get on with it. And the fact that there have been some very large-scale renewable energy projects built. Like, it's not talked about in the future anymore. It is here. So people want to get practical about making sure that they can actually benefit from that rather than companies just profiting but not actually anything going back. So those were the three things I think that really shifted the conversation just in that 12-month period.
And that, from my observation, would be, I mean, absolutely remarkable, because the government has been out to some of those northern communities who were very bruised by things like Bob Brown turning up. They read that as very disrespectful.
Absolutely, it was.
And it galvanised opposition, which was not galvanised beforehand, as you know. But also the state government then played right into that with workshops around carbon neutrality and how can we transition you. And that met with an extremely hostile response in some communities, so that they had to change the name of the project, etc.
Ah, really?
So
I'd like to have a chat with you about that offline, because I think I know the program you're talking about.
Anyway, the bottom line is just for me to reiterate that the change in the social culture and the willingness to embrace that level of change is pretty exciting.
Yeah. I was shocked. Especially the number of people who were saying, especially from coal-fired electricity plants, and it was a number, it wasn't just in one incident, saying, yeah, we need a transition plan. Doesn't the government have a just transitions group? Why haven't they done this already? And that was a complete shift within a couple of months. Beforehand, people arguing, no, don't shut us down. We don't want to talk about that. Don't use the transition word. To people going, yeah, well, haven't you done that yet? So but whether that keeps going or not, we'll see. Because again, this seems to open up and then close down again with different.
Yes, and usually triggered by elections as well.
That's not
Can I ask? Oh, sorry. Can I ask what time this has got to finish?
7.
Yes,
7.
around 7,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Did you have a question, Chris?
I did actually. I wondered if you had had any discussions about the GBR and the reef.
The Great Barrier Reef.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry. I'm thinking my brain went to like the German Republic.
No, not them.
Showing
Because
my age. Okay.
yeah.
The Great
Because
Barrier Reef.
obviously the tourist industry is going to suffer to some extent, and I don't know how much. But is there a recognition that the GBR is actually going to continue? And it's not just the GBR; it's reefs all over the world. I have a really limited life now because the heat is killing the coral, and as that gets worse in the sea, and all the energy is going into the sea. So, did that come up at all?
No, because we weren't really focused on climate change or impacts of climate. We were focused on trying to get people to talk about where are their sectors at now, where is there already action to reduce and absorb emissions or engage with renewable energy, and then how can we build on that? So
Did that include tourism?
Not specifically, no. But
Okay.
tourism came up in Cairns, but and it was very much around, well, we have the reef and the rainforest. We already have a green tourism brand. How do we actually build on that and actually look at, which I thought was interesting because I expected the opposite. I expected a kind of sense of desperation, we'll try anything, but it was actually like, no, our strength is this and we're going to double down on this and use the renewable energy we've got to actually think about carbon neutral holiday packages. But no, there wasn't discussion about the bleaching or the future of the reef.
And there is a consortium of organisations that have put together a economic stimulus package called the Green and Blue Recovery Plan. So, and it just focuses on, carbon, tourism and decarbonising tourism mostly,
and conservation and land management as well.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have some good triggers now with the Land Restoration Fund, where people and councils are looking to engage organisations who can deliver some interesting land use projects to reduce emissions. Jai wanted to ask a question, I think. Jai?
Yeah, great. Hi, my name's Jai. I'm actually down in New South Wales. I'm here with my wife as well, Jareth, who we both know Amanda and as well. And I just wanted to ask a question, I guess, a bit about where things are at the moment. And it's kind of two-pronged. I think they fit together. The first one is this idea about recovery from COVID. And, obviously there's a kind of bushfire recovery element to that as well in a lot of places. But this idea of recovery and what, like, all of this work was done before COVID happened. What you might
most of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
But what might you think? What might you think is different in terms of the world is going to be different after COVID, and a lot of things are going to be different. What do you see as some of those bigger trends that might influence what you've seen in the report and where things are at in the region? So has that sort of changed at all in terms of what people might be thinking where they're at? And then the second one to that is looking at this, the way in which the federal government is clearly backing gas as a recovery option and the kinds of long-term lock-in effects that has and the kind of opportunity cost of that for other industries as well. So just if you see those kind of things, how they might play out.
Yeah, so I think some of the last two forums were during the COVID period, but the things people were talking about weren't that drastically different. I think the difference though was a marked difference after the fires. So as I said, there were two things. So one was around advanced manufacturing, local processing capacity, and the second bit was around services. So the idea that services have been ripped out over time, and people were saying, we're kind of we don't have all the stuff that we used to have. So there's a sense of, we weren't using the word resilience, but there was a vulnerability around that. And so the discussion was, well, if you want to invest in stuff, invest in the things that make this place livable, would be an expression that I heard. So there was some of that before the fires, but that really came out a lot much stronger around regions leading, knowing their own place, knowing what they need, investing the things to make themselves more self-sufficient, and so that whatever external shocks come, they're actually able to deal with it. So I think that theme with the fires and COVID just got ramped up, really. And the second question around gas, yeah, it's an interesting one, because especially in Queensland, where there's been a large investment in renewable energy, the issue that kept being brought up, there's actually a high level of energy literacy, which was also different from, say, 18 months ago, with the same kind of industry players in the room talking about, okay, well, we're reaching the capacity in the grid, so unless we upgrade the transmission, we're going to have, we can't actually put more renewable energy into the grid. So there was discussion about needing to create a demand for that renewable energy to go somewhere, particularly in northern and central Queensland. And so people were talking about electrifying industry. So I think it's really interesting that the federal government is talking about gas, because industry in places that you'd think would support gas are actually saying, well, we need to electrify industry because renewable energy is the cheapest source of energy and we're not seeing the benefits of that. So we need to actually change our industrial processes. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in areas. Yeah. But at that stage, they were talking about it because the gas prices were still high for Australia. So now that the market has bottomed out for gas internationally, yeah. Yep. But Rosie might have some comments on that, because Rosie's involved in building some of the bigger renewable energy projects in central Queensland. Did you have a take on that?
Oh, how long have we got?
Sorry to put you in the hot seat. But how do you think that's going to play out?
And sorry, just you mean in particular the rollout of the transition to the new roles?
Rosie, can you just introduce yourself too?
Yeah, sorry. So well, yeah, when you introduce yourself, but I guess that so the other point, Jai, is that up until now, I think there's been very much an idea that you can have everything. We'll have coal and gas and we'll have renewable energy. What I was starting to hear from industry was there is an opportunity cost around where that investment's going to go. And so you've kind of got federal government saying, well, we need to invest in gas pipelines. While you're investing in gas pipelines, you're not investing in upgrading transmission infrastructure. But I don't know how far that conversation has played out anywhere. That's why I was thinking Rosie, who will introduce herself, might have some insights.
Gosh, yes. I was here tonight as a listener, not a contributor, but very happy. I will introduce myself. I'm probably the only developer on the call. And yes, that can be a nasty word. I work for Energy Estate, who are an renewable energy accelerator, and my role in particular is to drive community and stakeholder engagement for the projects that we're doing. And we are doing hydrogen, and we are doing wind, and we are doing solar. I've spent most of today talking to Beyond Zero Emissions about the $1 million jobs plan. So I'm talking about jobs, jobs, jobs all the time at the moment. And there is that trade-off, absolutely. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I think it's a bit along the lines of what the farmer, was that Kylie? Yes, it was Kylie. It's about super-proofing. I agree with you. Super-proofing the next generation of farmers, and super-proofing not just the new workers, but the transition of the coal workers, because people are afraid of the jobs disappearing. And we have to switch the narrative to, your jobs aren't disappearing, we're transitioning you. So it's that narrative of transition. It's not losing jobs, it's changing jobs. So our narrative is change, not loss, change, not loss. And could be described as a trade-off, but we prefer not to use that language.
Yeah, thanks.
But for Queensland, we're super excited. The announcement by your Premier last week, which dovetails nicely with the report from the Australian Conservation foundation that said, the appetite is here, the people are here, the skills are there, the investment in Queensland is there. We just need government to underpin the transmission. And voila, the next day that announcement was made.
Yeah,
So,
that was interesting timing.
So it's about super-proofing the people in the current jobs and super-proofing the people in the future, and that the training and skills are there.
Great. Other questions from people? A few new people coming on. Ah, hello. I can't see your name. Hazel.
Yes, my name's Hazel. I'm a grandma in Melbourne. I have no qualifications at all about any of this, but I belong to a lot of things to do with climate change, just as a volunteer trying to get the governments to do something. One of the things is also stopping the Adani mine. I just wonder, I'm sorry I missed about the first 10 minutes of this, I'm not sure which report you were referring to, but I just wonder, especially with the potential damage to the reef, the fact that they're allowed to have unlimited water for the next 50 years, I just wonder what the feeling is now in Queensland. I'm so enthused by this meeting tonight to hear all these positive things coming up. I think it is just sensational. So I'm delighted to be here. But I just wonder if you could just tell me, as a person with no qualifications, but I'm so worried about the future, not just for my grandchildren, but for the whole world. And all the environment, all the living things, every insect, every bee, every fish, everything. And we're still desperately trying to get this Adani mine to not go ahead.
Good luck.
So, so your question, Hazel? Or
I'm just wondering what the feeling is in Queensland among the general public about the Adani mine, because it seemed to me, when I heard what you said about the Bob Brown thing, I didn't realise how detrimental that was, as it turned out, apparently, just from your comment.
Yeah.
That people are scared they're going to, or were scared they were going to lose their jobs, but the potential with renewables is so extreme, and very, I'm sure you all watched Craig Newcastle the last 3 weeks.
I actually helped advise on that series.
Yes,
yeah.
no, it's sensational. Yes, and I think the more people who've watched that, to see the potential that is there, not just for jobs, but to help the whole environmental thing.
I think it's hard to, I can't speak for all of Queensland, but I'll offer a few reflections on. So we were up in Townsville 10 days after the Bob Brown convoy arrived in up north. They're only about 100 kilometres from people who don't know. The last stop was about 100k from where the mine is going to go in, and it made it impossible. Like, it was probably the hardest forum that we'd done, and it was interesting because I'd only been there 6 months before, and we'd had a really successful, positive, productive discussion with industry and government in particular, who were listing all the projects that they're working in, listing all the billions of dollars investment coming in around the fact that they had all these major renewable energy projects within 400 kilometres of Townsville. They couldn't actually get enough people to work on those projects. So it'd been a really positive conversation, like 6, maybe 9 months before that. The Bob Brown convoy went through, and the same people who said, let us know when the next time you're in town, we'll get more people to the event, said, I love this conversation and it's important, but I can't be associated with it because it's become too political. And that was really disappointing. And I ended up on stage with Bob Brown in September of last year at an event in Melbourne, and was really awkwardly had to disagree with him, somebody I respect greatly, but it was more about the strategy, I think, and the timing of that and the way it was done. I still think we need the groups that are going to be really clear about the fact that we're facing catastrophe, and there's a line that needs to be drawn in the sand. And that's really important discussion to have. Until now, though, we haven't been having enough discussions about the solutions and the way forward. We've been asking people to pick a side when people don't know what the future might hold. And people in those early forums we did last year were feeling very much under attack and very defensive, because they felt like the message was, you're telling me that I'm wrong because I work in the industry or my partner does or something like that. And tell me, you know, you're telling us it's the end of the world, but you're not giving us any answers around that. And I think last year, and that's why the hydrogen thing, I think, was a turning point, because it's heavy industry, it's a technology, it's an export. And so though people who would have felt alienated now went, okay, I can see there's a potential other industry here. It's not coal or nothing anymore. It opened up other possibilities. And so that fast forward from May, so it was just before the election, May last year, we did our next forum in Townsville just recently in July, end of July. Nobody mentioned Adani. It was really before people were defending it. And I actually had to ask the question. I was like, it's really interesting. Where's things at with Adani? And like, nobody's talking about it. It's there. We don't know what's going to happen. Is it actually going to happen? We don't know. So people kind of become ambivalent. They're not, whereas before they felt like they had to like defend it in the conversation. So that's a shift, I think. And people are a lot more uncertain around the future of coal, and they were expressing that they don't know what's going to happen. So maybe we should prepare for something else. And I think that's massive in a really relatively short period of time.
Thank you. Thank
Sorry,
you very
Adam?
much. Yes.
Emma, I think what you're highlighting is it's all about it's a mindset shift, and it's about thinking about things differently. And as recent as today, we met with Frank and Di Shaka, who are red tip bananas, and I don't know if any of you online know red tip bananas, but they're eco-organic banana farmers, which is completely running against the grain.
Oh, you're frozen.
Of banana in Australia, and yet they are the only product in Australia that exports to the world. And I suppose Frank is a very passionate person in relation to soil chemistry and microbes. And I'm not sure if Councillor Farinelli's there at all, because she's a personal friend of the Shaka family. But I suppose he's shared with us, and I suppose the changeology piece in relation to shifting the market from where it is now to something different. And he's got a premium product that he delivers that is now sought after all over the world. So I think, again, it's a mind shift piece, and whether you like Adani or not, or coal mining or whatever that is, it's about how we do things in a way that is sustainable.
Yeah.
I don't know if Councillor Farinelli's there at all still or not.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, Frank and Diane are doing amazing things with this eco-organics, and the beauty of them is their willingness to share. I think their willingness to actually show other farmers the benefits of farming this way, of this eco-organics. And you know, you go out anywhere now, even like I've been to visit some of the schools in our area, we've got young people you know, collecting the scraps at lunchtime, and they've got their buckets and they're separating their food scraps and what's going to the worm farm and what's going into the composting bin, and these are year 3 students, and the teachers are really nurturing them. And you know, that was one school in Mission Beach that's doing that, and we've just basically said these kids are onto the right thing, and they're going home then and they're educating their mums and dads, and it's fantastic. And if we can now get these young people to share their story with other schools, and that real focus on, you know, the way they're doing things. For us, especially, you know, on the Kasserine Coast, we're trying to reduce what goes into our landfills. If we can educate people, you know, how to do things differently, and that starts with the young people, and people like Frank and Diane Shaka that are just taking their farming to a new level, and their willingness is there to educate other farmers. And I really think we need to tap into that and bring them on board, and just basically share their story with farmers, with our farmers, and show them the way.
I think you've touched on something really important there, actually, and that was back to Selena's point earlier. I think the other major shift in the conversation was when people like Wendy, who's on the call, actually came up to talk about, there's a lived experience now in Australia of a not so great story of change, like a power station actually closing and seeing the impacts of that on a community, but also how the local government and community have come together and there are new economic opportunities now. So sharing the stories of where people are grappling with this, and we haven't had those stories until recently. So, and the Hunter is moving ahead and all sorts of really interesting things. The Beyond Zero Emissions Million Jobs report is another piece in that puzzle. So that conversation has shifted to what's possible, and there's real people with real stories who can talk to that. And in the forums, when Wendy spoke or Julie spoke or Dan spoke, that was the turning point. Like, we can do all the graphs, but when Wendy gets up there and tells the story, you can't, you know, it's not political anymore. It's somebody's lived experience. But Wendy, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to just talk about how wonderful you are?
My internet's not very stable. We're having a bit of a storm tonight, so I'm sitting upstairs and I'm shaking to leave the house. But anyway, yeah, I think really that lived experience, and I think Rosie hit it as well, that looking forward and telling the successful stories, that what the farmers have done with the bananas and things like that. Sometimes we waste so much time fighting the Adanis or the other coal mines. And if I can, I'll just take a liberty and share an experience. So when Hazelwood, we knew, was a very dirty, probably the world's most polluting power station, we knew it was going to close. The rumours had been going around for years that it would close. The lack of maintenance and what was happening in that power station, there was clear evidence, but we still had people coming into town, and I'm saying coming into our town to say, shut Hazelwood, we've got to, you know, tie ourselves to the power station, we've got to shut Hazelwood. But what we did, we actually turned that conversation around, that we didn't need to shut Hazelwood. Let Hazelwood shut itself. Let's work out how we transition. How do we support the workers and community? And once with that actual shift of, you know, people not coming down anymore to say shut Hazelwood, we were starting to call for transition, start creating hope, and hope for the workers. Of course, if you're going to take away jobs, and Rosie said it, and, you know, I'm going to shut a power station and not give you a job, of course people are going to fight for it. They're like 5-year-old children. You know, you're going to take something away from them. Of course they're going to become strong and really fight. How about we offer them something? How about we offer them the hope, the jobs that are in renewables? Forget about the Adanis and everything. Whatever happens there will happen. We're creating a positive future. And once we started working with people in that area, and we saw that a lot in, you know, travelling Queensland when I was invited up, the people actually turned and understood that. They actually went, yeah, let's let them do what they do. And I know, you know, behind closed doors, as Amanda has said, and even in Latrobe Valley, we see power stations saying we have to transition. We have to do things different. You know, we have the AGLs down here saying, actually, energy is changing. We have to see how we can stabilise it through the night when maybe the sun isn't shining. You know, so the companies are doing that themselves. Let's actually focus on what we can do and what communities can do and what councils can do, because communities actually want to be involved in the change. They just don't want to be pushed away from what they have already, because when it comes to it, they want to feed their kids.
I think that's an excellent note to maybe wrap up on. Thank you, Wendy, and thanks for coming up and sharing your story and being such a really important part of the conversations, because it really did make a massive difference. Okay, well,
one last question.
Yeah, we're over time.
I just wanted to ask, what's next following on from this?
Yeah, so the whole process wasn't about developing a report. The report actually was really more about COVID and sort of saying, well, we've got ideas, we should tell you. So to me, the process was the main focus, was how do we have a safe conversation about this so people can start exploring it. We've had a number of councils follow up with us, wanting us to help them work out what the next steps are around either transition planning or specific aspects around what they want to do next, and hosting a broader conversation with a broader community that they want to lead, which is really exciting. We've sent it through to, I've already had a lot of meetings with ministers early on during the COVID, so that's been fed into some of the government work. And we're going to send it out again to the MPs, state and federal MPs of all of the regions that we visited, to make sure that they have seen these results, and we've made the offer if they want to meet with us to talk through in more detail. So yeah, that's it for the moment, but I'm always open to ideas if people have other ideas about what we can do next.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
So thanks everyone for coming, and for your interest, and feel free to share the report. If there are other people that you're talking to who want more information, please get in contact with us. We're always up for a chat.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma Kate.
Thanks everybody for
Emma
coming.
Kate. Emma Kate was the master organizer.
Thanks, Emma Kate.
You're very welcome. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You've got access to the report, and we will send a recording out as a follow-up as well.
Thanks everyone.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to
Thank
see you
you.
all. Bye-bye.
Ciao.